Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rennie, and today we're getting mindful about organisational psychology. And helping us to unpack this big phrase, I've got an expert in the field, Clifford Morgan from Brisbane, Queensland. How you going, Cliff?
Good, thank you, Simon. It's great to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
I've been pumped for this for quite a while, and the reason being I've worked in many organisations over my professional career at 15 years in the public service and worked with a very diverse range of leaders and, staff members, and some of it was great and some of it was not so great. So keen to unpack that with you today, because I know there's a lot of guys out there who are working in various fields. They're also leaders in their own right as well. So I think you've got some words of wisdom to impart on us all, and I think it's going to be a really insightful episode today. But to introduce you to the audience, you've served with the Royal Australian Air Force for over 17 years, and now you're an endorsed organisational psychologist. You've coached everyone from CEOs to military commanders, frontline workers, even Commonwealth Games hopefuls. So I'm keen to unpack that a little bit, if you don't mind. And you're also the author of The Coaching Leader. And to add to all that, you also operate Lumian Consulting as well. So quite a CV. Let's go into the Commonwealth Games, but how did you get into that space, and what can you share from that experience?
Yeah, look, so definitely I'll put it out there and caveat what I'm about to say, in that I am not, sports psychology is not my forte, or I guess an area that I spend a whole lot of time in. That being said, I'm about to start a bit of an engagement with another Queensland youth sporting team. But yeah, no, look, the Commonwealth Games one was an opportunity that arose in my time in the Air Force, in that I was coaching, I was doing a bit of studying psychology at that time. And a colleague of mine, she was a physical training instructor, but she was also a runner. And her BHAG, those big, hairy, audacious goals for any Jim Collins fans out there, was to be selected for the Commonwealth Games. And so for a short season, I was coaching her through some of the mindset and, some of the psychology-based things around her performance in that particular space. She had kind of, her sports traders and coaches and that sort of thing from the actual technical running side of things. But yeah, we worked a little bit in that sports psychology space. But so while I don't spend a whole lot of time there, is definitely a lot of principles, kind of the high performance principles that come from sports psychology that I do. I have used in whether I'm coaching air crew in the Air Force or the corporate athletes in the marketplace. And so I really enjoy the sports psychology or the high performance psychology side of stuff, and taking those principles and applying them. I get more opportunity to apply them outside of sport than inside of sport, but definitely an area of interest of mine, Simon.
I'm interested, before we get into organisational psychology and what it is, how did you actually come into this field? Was it something that you always wanted to do, or did you naturally fall into it? Where did this expertise come from?
I smile because the running joke is that I had nothing else better to do. And so, look, I was in the military. I was actually at uni studying to be a teacher, and got frustrated in uni, decided to take 12 months off and go and do some military training. And the plan was always to go back to my university studies. But 5.5 years later, I was still there. I loved it so much. Really enjoying my time in the Air Force there as a weapons instructor and patrol commander, doing a lot of airfield defence. So infantry skill set, but defending air bases. But that was only ever going to be a temporary thing for me. It was never going to be a 30-year career. So I was still really loving it, but I was up for promotion and posting. And as much as I would have enjoyed that next role, I decided the longer I stay in, the harder it will be to get out and do something else. So I bit the bullet and I discharged from the Air Force, not knowing what I was going to do. And my dad at the time suggested, well, why don't you do psychology? And literally I said, well, I've got nothing else better to do, so let's give it a try and see how it turns out. And I haven't looked back. Absolutely loved it. And so, that kind of started my studies in psychology. I was still doing reserve work as a weapons instructor to kind of pay my mortgage while I was going through my studies. And during that particular time, given my studies, I got roped into helping stand up the Air Force Leadership Coaching Program locally at RAAF Amberley outside of Brisbane here. And so that was really my introduction to the coaching space. So it's this combination of my studies in psychology and, coaching initially in the Air Force context, and then they've kind of both combined to really the majority of the work that I do today.
What's your take on calling yourself a coach? I know a lot of people in the allied health system, I'm a social worker, I know counsellors, I know psychologists, psychiatrists who want to get into coaching because I think it broadens our practice framework. But there's also a bit of a stigma or, I don't know, a little bit of shame or something like that about calling yourself a coach. I think it's a great word. And I, in fact, when I meet a new guy in Mindful Men, my therapy business, I say, you can call me a coach if you don't want to call me a therapist, because I like the idea of coaching. What do you think about the coach-psychologist dynamic?
So, look, I think I'll start off talking about the coaching and the coaching skill set. And I think it is one of the most valuable skill sets that you will ever have. Whatever profession you're in, I say that if you've got coaching skills will make anything that you do as a leader better, right? Whether that's your own performance and you're conducting whatever your role is in your task by yourself. If you have coaching skills, you can self-coach in order to get a better outcome for your work, but you can also coach other people and lift their standards as well. And so, I can talk about even the most instructional tasks, which is kind of the most far from coaching, I guess. If coaching is just asking questions and the instruction is telling people, even the most instructional tasks, if you use coaching skills, you get a much better outcome, right? So anything that you do can be enhanced by the use of coaching skills. So I think it's one of the most valuable skill sets that you'll have in life. And even outside the workplace, Simon, I consider myself to be a much better father and husband because I have coaching skills, and it really did change and strongly influence the way that I parent my kids as well. So the coaching skill set, I think, is so valuable, and I'm a big believer in it, believe that everybody should have at least some rudimentary understanding of what it is and capability to use it. Now, when it comes to calling yourself a coach, where the stigma that you were referring to comes from is that coaching is an unregulated profession. And so that means anybody can call themselves a coach. Even if you have no training, no qualifications, no experience coaching anyone, you can put your shingle up, call yourself a coach, and start charging people money for that. Now, so there's a very low barrier of entry to becoming a coach. Now, that's great in the sense that for those people that have a lot of experience and are really have a lot to impart, then they can do that very readily. What it does mean, however, is that you get a really wide variety of people's skill set and experience and ability there. And so you get some people that probably shouldn't be helping others, calling themselves a coach and charging people exorbitant amount of money for very little value. And that's, I think, people that have that experience get a really bad taste in their mouth. So that's kind of the origin of the stigma. It is what it is. It's something you can't necessarily change. You've really got to have a look at your client base and what you want to be known for, and your reputation and all that sort of thing, and figure out, do I want to call myself a coach? I might be using coaching skills, and but do I want to be a therapist versus a coach? People will have different mindsets, and you might refer to that different people depending on the different contexts and all that sort of thing. But for me, a big part of what I do is equip leaders with coaching skills. So for me to not call myself a coach is, there's this discrepancy there in that space. But at the same time, I am an organisational psychologist. There is a vast kind of realm of psychological expertise that I bring to my coaching that is very much a differentiating factor. And people don't just come to me because I'm a coach. They come to me because I'm an organisational psychologist who coaches. And what I would say is, for anyone that's exploring using that term, is what's your differentiating factor? For me, it's the combination of my military experience and my psychological expertise. Because coach is so general and so widely used, like, what's the differentiating factor you're going to add to the term coach? And for me, that's kind of my advice in that space.
It's a great space to blend learned and lived experience, whether it's a lived experience of a mental health condition like my experience was, or if it's your career, whether you're in the military or in white collar, blue collar, any type of work as well. I think there's certainly some benefits to it. And I think this is the Mindful Men community. A lot of guys actually resonate with the word coach as well, which is really positive. Australia, we're sports mad, and so we've all grown, most of us are grown up either watching sport, playing sport, and understand that coach dynamic. So I think it's actually a really cool term to use, and it's a horses for courses term. So when someone walks into my clinic and they say, I need a therapist, I'm like, okay, I'm the therapist today. Or they go, I actually don't want to talk about any of the deep and meaningful stuff. I actually just want tools. I want some coaching strategies as well. And so I'm like, okay, you can call me a coach today. Whatever you want to call me, whatever works. It's definitely a horses for courses. And as you said, it's really important to go behind the label and work out what's the structure, what's the framework behind Cliff or Simon or whoever is doing this kind of work, and can I work with them? Are they going to be able to actually help me as well?
Yeah. 100%.
All right. So this isn't about coaching, but it is about coaching at the same time. So I'm keen, we've bantied around this word, organisational psychology. Can you describe it for us, for those who haven't heard of the term before? What is it and how can it be useful?
Look, organisational psychology in its simplest, conception or simplest understanding of it is simply taking psychological science and applying it within the organisational context, within organisations and workplaces. And so that's what I say I do, is I take psychology and apply it in the workplace, and I help leaders get the most out of their people in the workplace, right? And help their people get the most out of work in their life. So you can describe organisational psychology in many different ways. I think one of the ones that a lot of people like is Adam Grant, who is kind of many of your listeners would know, is the poster child of organisational psychology around the world these days. But he describes organisational psychology as the profession that studies how to make work not suck, which I think kind of resonates with a lot of people. And so as a psychologist in general, you are trained as in what we call the scientist practitioner model. So you're trained to be a scientist and apply the scientific method to whatever the field of focus for you. So for us, it's workplaces and in organizations. We're taking psychological science, we're looking at how do we apply it in the workplace, and we're studying this world of work and how can we make it a better experience for staff, leaders more effective in their role, and how do we increase kind of performance and the outcomes for everyone. And the thing to be aware of, right, is if we look at psychology itself as a broader profession, there is so much within that. Even just today, we've kind of spoken about the organisational psychology piece, the sports psychology piece, the clinical psychology piece, with which relates to the therapy that you're doing. There's educational and development psychology. There is a community psychology, which is kind of looking at more social and large communities. I know I've missed forensic psychology. I do a bit of work with the psychologists with Queensland Corrections that focus on the criminal element of the community, I guess. So there's a really broad range of psychological practices, or what we call in the field areas of expertise, areas of endorsed practice. And so as you mentioned right at the beginning, I'm an endorsed organisational psychologist, which means I've specialised in organisational psychology. Just as you think about the medical profession, you have doctors that specialise as, orthopaedic surgeons or optometrists or whatever. Then I've specialised as an organisational psychologist. But then within organisational psychology itself, that's really broad as well. So, we've got the recruitment and selection side of things, the assessment and personality side of things. We've got ergonomics and work design is in there. We've got, the culture piece and teams. We've got the whole area of psychosocial hazards is a really big one at the moment, given the change of legislation that came in last year. So there's a really broad range of areas to focus on within organisational psychology. For me, I say that I focus on strategy, leaders and teams, right? And so I'm using psychology in a way that helps leaders and their teams perform at their peak and pursue their potential. And I challenge mindsets, influence culture and empower people. Like that's kind of what I do. And it's really around helping leaders define and implement strategy, helping teams to become the high performance team and operate better and have great culture, and then the leader development. So whether that's leadership skills training, whether that's individual one-on-one coaching, that space. So that's kind of a bit of an overview of organisational psychology and where I fit within it.
It's so broad and so dynamic as well. And I think everything we talk about these days often has a spectrum. Spectrum seems to be the buzzword at the moment, but it's so true. And they all interplay with each other as well. So what you're doing in HR compared to culture, compared to values, compared to KPIs and all this organisational stuff and team dynamics and recruitment, it all interplays with each other. They're not isolated silos, even though we create silos in organisations to deal with those specific issues as well. I'm interested, like from your experience, both in the military, but also doing what you do now with organisations, why do workplaces suck? Like what's the key trends or themes that you see when you walk into a business and going, hey, yeah, that sucks. Like let's try and work on that. What do you see as the trends?
I think first of all, we've got to recognise that workplaces are work, right? And work means we have to work. And so often that means there's a level of effort that's required. It can be hard, right? In order to get anything meaningful done, there needs to be a level of hardship or exertion or something, that investment that's made in order to get the result at the end. That's true in life for all of us, and that's why we set goals, and it's the growth that happens along the journey to achieving the goals that often provide meaning or a sense of meaning for a lot of people in life. When we come to the workplace and organizations, it's that same principle, but at a collective level. What we are doing with any business or organization is we're saying, okay, cool, there's a need and we need to work towards meeting that need. And that's why we come together, because we can achieve more together, but we've still got to do the work in order to meet the need, right? And so I was having a coaching conversation just this morning, speaking to a CEO about this. And there's a lot that's said at the moment around the younger generations coming through, and, they're not as resilient as other generations, and, very much entitled and all that sort of stuff. And I think, well, to a degree, the reality is they've got a different set of expectations. And a lot of the challenges in the intergenerational leadership, right, comes down to those expectations not being met on either side. And when you think about the younger generation coming through, we've done a whole lot of work, particularly led by my profession, right, to understand work, to understand workplaces, to understand leadership, and to identify what is a good workplace. What is a workplace that doesn't suck? What is a good leadership, and how does that look like? And so the younger generations coming up, they've been grown up being exposed to the Simon Sinek's of the world, the Brene Browns, the Adam Grants, all these people that are really kind of promoting, hey, here's really good workplace practice. Here's what you need to do in order to have a great workplace. And so these younger generations are coming through expecting, because all this information's out in the world, that their workplace is going to implement that, or that's going to be their experience. But the reality is that, one, not every workplace is able to do a lot of the things that are spoken about. And just even if they do, it doesn't take away the hardship or doing hard work that is in a workplace. And so some of the expectations of younger generations are unrealistic. Now, we look at the older generations and they've come through workplaces and generations and done work for decades where none of that information was available to them. Good leadership practice wasn't role model to them, and they probably haven't been trained in what those good leadership practices are. And so they create workplaces and environments that don't have any of that. Not because they're intending to, but because they, again, have never had a role model. They've never experienced it. So they don't know how to create a workplace that doesn't suck, if we want to use that kind of language. And so their expectation of the younger generations is often that they would be as resilient as they were, that they will kind of suck it up and, do what they had to do in order to work and progress in their career. Whereas the younger generations have a very different set of expectations based on everything that they've been exposed to. And so what we often find is we've got these differing expectations that are unmet on both sides, and that causes conflict and frustration and all sorts of things. And what I would say is that a workplace that doesn't suck is probably where the leaders' expectations are met by the staff and the staff's expectations are met by the leaders. And, both sides are taking responsibility and ownership for one, meeting the expectations of the other, and for doing what is necessary in order to, commit to the organisation's goals, whatever they are. So people are investing and they've got skin in the game. They're owning the organisation, both its results and its experience. And, they're communicating, they're meeting from a leadership perspective and a staff perspective, regularly, and engaging in a way that is really healthy and that promotes a great experience for everybody and also produces the results that are desired. So bit of a roundabout explanation rather than a succinct one for you. But I think, in modern organisations, that's probably, I think, one of the lenses that you can look on it that's really relevant today when it comes to making a workplace a healthy one and making it one that doesn't suck.
I love that. And as you were talking, it reminded me of when my little boy, so he's 8 now and he's in year 2, but when he started prep a couple of years ago, and the principal had all the kids and the parents all, in a big assembly, welcoming them to the school. And the principal said, this is a generation, and particularly, he's a younger generation, so he hasn't even entered the workplace yet, but that generation might have 20 careers in his lifetime compared to me. I think the expectation from me as a 40-year-old, maybe it might have been 2 or 3, maybe 5 if I was really moving around a bit. My dad's generation was the one job, maybe 2 jobs. So there's a different expectation again on maybe for the younger generations. If it sucks too much, I'm just going to move on, and there's going to be new opportunities. And we see that a lot with the advancements in tech. In the last 5 years, maybe even 10 years of my public service career, tech was becoming more and more of a thing. AI was becoming more of a thing, more automation. So almost we had to continuously redesign our roles to stay relevant in the modern day workplace. And I think that will also influence a lot of younger generations to move around, find jobs that suit them.
The reality is there's never been more opportunity for them to go elsewhere. If their needs aren't being met in their current role or organisation, there's never been more opportunity for them, not only because of the roles and potential jobs and opportunities that are there, but also the social stigma of leaving has, drastically or almost non-existent these days. So it's why leadership is so important. It's one of the reasons why I invest so much time into leaders and leadership, because if the leadership's not there, then the organisation is not going to keep people. And, the retention piece is one of the biggest challenges facing modern leaders today.
So I guess when you walk into an organisation and you start working with a leader, where do you start? How do you start to unpack it? What's the first thing you write on the top of your page? Where does this all begin?
Yeah, interesting. So it looks slightly different depending on the engagement, right? And so if I'm just coaching one individual leader, it's going to be more about the individual and their role and kind of what's going on for them. If I'm coming into an organisation to consult on an organisation-wide project, then I'm very much taking a bit of a different approach. But the starting point for me is, what's the context? Tell me about the organisation and the system within which we're operating in. And this is probably one of the biggest differentiators between organizational psychology versus clinical psychology or counseling psychology. In that clinical and counseling, you're very much focused on tell me about you as an individual, and I'm going to focus on you and solving your problems and helping you. And in order to do that, we might go beyond the individual and look at some of the environmental factors within which you're operating within, but the starting point is always the individual. Whereas for organizational psychology, we're starting with the organization as a system, and we're looking at the whole system, and it's when we understand that, or the key components of that, then we'll start delving down to the individual leader and, okay, so where do you fit within the system? And now we understand kind of the environment that you're operating within, then we can kind of understand what are the influences there, what are the mechanisms that we have to play, and understand all of that. Where's the alignment? Where's the misalignment? And so often there may be things that we go, okay, so rather than changing the system to the individual, which is what a lot of clinical, it's an approach, and I don't want to bag this because I've got some great friends who are clinically trained and now work within organizations. They do a fabulous job. What we find with a lot of people that they're trained as a clinician and they step into an organizational environment is they try and change the environment to the individual or the individual to the environment without actually looking at the broader system. Whereas for organizational psychology, we look at the broader system and we go, okay, cool. Is there a pattern where this negative effect is affecting multiple people, in which case let's change the system? Or are there any system changes that we can make that will provide, multiple other benefits to enhance the system that might alleviate a problem with an individual, rather than start with the individual and go, okay, cool, right? Like we're going to change the system in response to you. And so it may be, hey, here's the constraints, the organizational system and everything that's going on here. Like we're constrained by that. We can't make changes there. And so therefore, what do we need to do for you to be adaptive? What changes do you need to make within that context to make it work for you? And so that's starting with understanding the organization as a system is probably the starting point. And when I'm coaching people, I don't talk about organizational systems and things like that. I talk about what's the context. Okay. And what I'll say is the context will determine what is required from you as a leader, and therefore what leadership in terms of behaviors you need to demonstrate and mechanisms of influence you need to use is required to be successful. What makes you successful in one context is not going to make you successful in another context. And the classic example here is Sir Winston Churchill. And he was a brilliant wartime leader, but he was a failed post-war prime minister. It only took him 4 months and he was booted out of parliament because he couldn't adjust and adapt to the changing context of the British people and their expectations post-war. So that understanding the context, and then we're understanding, okay, what's required from the leader, what behaviors need to be demonstrated. And those behaviors may be internal, right? You've got to change. Or they may be external. How do we engage with people? How do we lead in that space? So self-leadership versus leadership of others. And, that applies that concept there of what I call context-based leadership applies at multiple different levels. It applies, if you're coaching an individual leader, it applies for a team. And so I do a lot of working with executive teams. And it's like, hey, let's reorientate to the context. What qualities does the current context require from you as a team? And therefore, what do you need to do in order to achieve your mission? It applies to the organization level as well from a strategic perspective. And you say, what's the current environment? What's the context within which the organization is operating? And what does that require from the organization? And therefore, what do we need to do from a strategy perspective there? So that interplay is there, but it all starts with understanding the context, Simon. So that's really where I start.
It was interesting as you were talking about that. It reminded me of my last couple of years in the public service, and COVID happened, and we went from a context where everything was in an office to face-to-face meetings with our clients. It was very much go, go, go. But then COVID happened, and it's almost like organizational psychology was thrust upon organizations to start looking after staff. And I say this because in the environment that I worked in, it was very much a high KPI environment. It was do, don't stop doing, because this is the system that we work in. We have to keep going. You're important, but also the people that we're serving are important as well. So you must continue doing. And to the point where people burnt out. I burnt out as well. And this is where I guess Mindful Men was born, as my burnout story of me just sharing it. This is what burnout feels like. This is what it felt like in the workplace. This is the systems that I was working in and around that. And all of a sudden we had a complete shift where all of a sudden staff well-being was very important. And it was like people checking in all the time. What are we doing on Teams thing? How do we make Teams fun? And I remember when I burnt out and I took quite a bit of time off. It was about 3 to 4 months off of work. And I was talking to my manager when I came back to work. And I was very fortunate because they allowed me to do the graduated return to work to get back on my feet. But my manager said at the time, she goes, Simon, if this happened 12 months ago before COVID, I think our conversations would be very much different in terms of your taking time off, your recovery, because we had a different leadership structure in that was very much the go, KPIs is the only thing that's important. Whereas COVID happened, and that's why I always say I thank COVID for happening from my mental health perspective, because it allowed me to go, you know what, I'm not doing okay. And it allowed my team member next to me to say, I'm not doing okay. And I think that was a huge systems change just from the global pandemic. And now what I'm seeing is in the guides that I work with, but also in the social circles that I'm in, is that it feels like we're going back to life before COVID. It's everyone come back to the office. Work from home was fun for a while, but we want you back. We need you back. In fact, don't care about your welfare as much as we did during COVID. How have you seen that? Like I'm that interplay between COVID, mental health in the workplace, I guess groundswell from junior staff. I was a junior staff member compared to leadership and what they're trying to achieve as well.
Yeah, look, really interesting. Never waste a good crisis, right? What is it? The Chinese characters for crisis is danger and opportunity. And I think I always look, whenever there's a problem, I always like, okay, yes, there's a problem, but what's the opportunity this provides? And so really the opportunity that COVID provided for us was to recalibrate what is important to us. And that's from a personal perspective and our personal well-being. And we saw that particularly early on, and people allowing them to engage in a whole lot of wellbeing-based activities because they didn't have to go into work. But also from a work perspective as well. And, as you were talking and describing there's a particular model that is very foundational in organisational psychology, and it's the job demands resources model. And it basically says that the job demands, the higher the level of demands that your work places on the individual worker, right, or the team, then the more stress and burnout they're going to experience, which affects performance. But the resources there are as well. So the higher the level of resources that somebody has in the workplace, so things that are beneficial, that enable them to do it, that kind of fill their cup and allow them to recover and, all that sort of stuff, increases the level of engagement and satisfaction and fulfillment that they experience in the workplace, which obviously impacts performance as well. And so there's this interplay that happens there. As we were saying, work is work. It's always going to have demands on us. And so we can't remove those demands. But what we can do is we can look at potentially trying to reduce the amount of demands on us. And therefore, we can look at trying to boost the number of resources that we have in the workplace. And I think what COVID did was there was what it did places a whole lot of demands on everybody. And therefore, we all kind of had to go, okay, cool. How do we boost the resources for our people so that they can manage, the demands that are in place, right? And that happened at a whole lot of different levels and in different ways. But as we're coming back, I think it's really important that we think about it in, it's a really helpful way for leaders to think about the workplace in. Yes, like how do we minimize demands? We can't remove all those, but what are the unnecessary demands that are present? How do we remove those? And then how do we boost the level of resources that are there for people? And it's finding that balance is really hard, right? COVID most workplaces were too inflexible before COVID, and then COVID forced us into the other extreme of being completely flexible. And then what I saw for a lot of workplaces was they were forced to allow people to work from home and have that extreme flexibility. What I actually saw, and as many organizations experienced this, was that flexibility then became like an entitlement or a right for people. There was an expectation that just because work could be done elsewhere, that they didn't have to come into the workplace. And so there, as we're returning in, what we were finding was there'd be an arrangement that was made and say, hey, I'm going to have work Fridays from home, or 2 days a week from home, whatever it was. And then something would happen in the workplace. And it actually was going to be really beneficial to have staff in the workplace. And you're getting staff that would turn around and go, sorry, I can't come in because that's my day off. And then it was the staff who were being too inflexible towards the organisation. And it's this rebound, I guess, that's driving a lot of the return to the workplace mandates and things like that we're seeing in public at the moment. And really, for me, I think COVID was great in that it forced us to have the capability to be more flexible and to do work from elsewhere. But we've got to find the balance, right? Particularly when it comes to flexibility. Organisations need to be flexible towards their staff, and staff need to be flexible towards their organisations. Again, it's shifting. I think in society, we focus too much on what our rights are versus what our responsibilities are. And for me, I'm like, if everybody look after their responsibilities, then rights become a moot point. And so the organisation needs to be responsible towards its staff, as in reducing demand, increasing resources, allowing the flexibility for them to get the best experience in work. But staff need to be flexible towards their organisation in terms of meeting the requirements of the organisation and enduring the demands of work, but also taking responsibility for their own resources and developing their own resources. It's not just on the organisation to build those resources. There's a level of responsibility that staff have to look after themselves in order to do the work that they need to for the organisation, right? And so it's responsibilities both ways, and owning outcomes and being proactive and initiative. And I'm thinking a lot of organisations I think are struggling, particularly here in Australia, to respond to the psychosocial hazards legislation that was brought in last year around how do we find that balance, right? And I'm helping a couple of organisations at the moment to navigate implementing their response to that legislation and try and find, and it's difficult. And I think part of it, as I mentioned before, is the expectations of workforce versus leaders. They're not aligned there. So I really think that there's a conversation that needs to be had both openly and flexibly between the organisation and really the organisation's leaders and their staff to find out what's the best way forward and to be flexible in that, because whatever the best way forward is, context changes. Your personal context changes, and you might have an elderly parent that gets sick or something going on with your kids at school. And so the organisation kind of needs to be flexible enough to allow for that. But then at the same time, the workload of the organisation goes up and down. There are periods in retail, the Christmas, New Year period is peak season, right? Staff need to kind of step up to the plate throughout peak season. Or I do a bit of work in engineering for you win a big project, you've got to step up to the plate for the length of that project and give a little bit more. But at the same time, the organisation then needs to reward that and sort of say, hey, you've gone above and beyond. I'm going to be a little bit more flexible for you to do that. So I really think it's that good communication between leadership and staff and being flexible in what that looks like, and constantly talking and checking in with each other as the interaction piece, but it's also the responsibility piece that is so crucial in this area.
I'm interested in that communication between leaders and staff as well. And I remember in my time, there's been a few times where I've done an organisational training day where they've done things like disc profiling and trying to understand the dynamics between what kind of a leader are you or employee are you. I was always the creative one. which is why I
Hence
do
why you're doing a
podcasting.
podcast. That's right, yeah.
And why I couldn't sit still, and why systems really, I struggle with them as well. But from that perspective, like from a profiling perspective, what kind of balance is needed between leadership and the staff, and how does that interplay with their communication between each other?
Look, team profiling, whether you're doing DISC or team management profile or any of the others out there, is a great thing to do. What I would say is that the primary benefit of that, though, is the conversation that it sparks rather than the profile itself. The profile is a catalyst for conversation. The conversations are, or the profile, whichever one you use and whatever the content of it is, whatever you come out as, is secondary to the conversation that you have with your colleagues and your leaders around how do we work best together. And so really what the profile does is it provides a common language to facilitate that conversation. So whether you're a D or an I, you're right, or whether you're creative or you're practical, or you're creative innovator versus a concluder producer, right, or thruster organizer, whatever your profile is, it provides you a common language to say, hey, this is kind of who you are and what your behavioral preferences are. This is who I am, and we're different here. So we can now be intentional about leveraging the diversity within the team. But we can also sort of say, well, hey, here's the potential risks and the rub points, or we're having a conflict. It's like, okay, cool, I understand why we're having conflict, because who you are as a person or the way that you're wired, you prioritize X, Y, and Z. Whereas you're being creative type, I prioritize A, B, and C, right? So we've got competing priorities here. Okay, awesome. Now that we're aware of that, what are we going to do moving forward? I often say that we're controlled by what we're not aware of. Once we become aware of something, we can choose to exert control over it. And so in this particular context, it's like if we're not aware of how the difference in our makeup is at play within a situation, then we can't be intentional about controlling it or leveraging it in that space. So it's great from a leader's perspective to understand where everybody is, because the more you know about a person, the more you can predict their behavior, the more you can trust them to behave in a particular way in the future, right? And so the more you know about a person as a leader, the greater your influence, the more mechanisms of influence that are available to you. And therefore, it's easier for you to have the conversation then, because leadership is done by 1,000 conversations, right? The conversation, the communication is the mechanism of influence in many cases, or the primary mechanism of influence for leaders. And so it just facilitates that communication in many ways.
As you were talking, I was thinking about values. I've worked in a lot of organisations that have values. These are the values of our organisation, and nobody ever knows who created the values. As a practitioner myself in acceptance and commitment therapy, values are a core part of what I do in mindfulness-based practice. And I always think there is a bit of a challenge when you might work for an organisation who has certain values, but those values don't align necessarily with your personal core values, which a lot of us haven't really done the work on our core personal values, but we can kind of see the tension. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on organisational values and maybe what, say, leaders or even junior staff can do if maybe the values of the organisation aren't playing out like they expect, or maybe they're having a bit of a clash there.
I guess the place that I'll start, like one of the foundational principles that underpins all my work is unless you can clearly articulate it, you can't be intentional about actioning it. So the process of articulating it, whatever it is, because I challenge people to find an area of life where that principle doesn't apply. It applies to absolutely everything. So whatever it is, unless you can clearly articulate what it is, you can't be intentional about doing whatever you need to do in order to make it better or resolve it, right? So from a values perspective, the reason that we articulate values is that so people can be intentional about meeting the behavioral expectations that are there. Whenever you find a conflict, particularly in a cultural space within an organization, if you look at it from a values lens, you can often identify the source of the conflict being a violation of values, or a violation of the expectations that people have around how those values are played out and manifest within the life of the organization. And once you can identify that, it's like, okay, cool, now I understand what's going on. Once you understand what's going on, then you can figure out a path forward. For a lot of people, it's again, I kind of say, well, stop and articulate. What is it? Get clear as to what you're going on. And it's the initial part of a coaching conversation is figuring out what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's the goal that we're chasing, what's the outcome that we want at the end, and getting super clear on that before we even consider what we're going to do in order to get from A to B. And I think that it's just so true in any organizational life. So if there's a conflict relating to values, identify, get clear for yourself as to what is that violation, what is that conflict, what's the unmet expectation. All conflict is a result of unmet expectations. So what's the expectation that's not being met? And that may be an expectation of behaviors that are demonstrated. It may be that, hey, there's a personal mismatch between my values and the organizational values. You've got to do the work to sit down and clearly articulate what your values are first in order to be able to identify where that mismatch is. But again, once you have made that identification, then you say, okay, cool, what's the next step? What's the outcome that I want here? Do I need to hold somebody accountable? Do I need to make something known and make some people aware? A lot of leaders don't make changes because they're not aware that changes are needed. So do I need to increase awareness here? Or, fundamentally, if we look at the organizational system and, values being played out the way they are, is there too much of a mismatch between the organizational values and my personal values that I need to find another workplace? But again, it comes down to the clarifying, clearly articulating what is the problem, what is the outcome, and then you can be intentional about figuring out what needs to happen moving forward. Does all that make sense, Simon?
It does. I love how you pictured it as what is the unmet need? And just because we have a values clash, it doesn't mean we can't build a bridge to overcome that challenge. I often say in this world, once we can name it, we can tame it. If we're bringing that awareness to why the conflict exists in the first place, what are the systems around? This is why I love systems theory and all that type of stuff. I love that interplay between micro and macro and all the in-between levels as well. Don't ask me to name the in-between levels, but I like to go micro and macro. But yeah, once we can name it, we can tame it. We can move forward, we can build the bridge. And so I am mindful that I was about to unpack 15 years of public service, his career with you, but I will let you go in a second. The last question I'll ask from an organisational psychology perspective, and I think it might be a good time to plug Lumian Consulting as well, and what you do there is when you're working with a leader or a team, what's one of the key things that you can maybe impart on the community that we've got here at Mindful Men to look out for in building a successful, cohesive team?
So I guess whenever I'm engaging in part, again, what's the common language? I think when it comes to teamwork and teams, it's the interaction between individuals that allows them to collaborate in order to produce more than they would if they're working, disparately. And so, as we mentioned, that the communication and the collaboration, like the communication piece is the primary mechanism for collaboration and therefore the cohesion of the team. So what's the common language for your team? And is everybody clear around that common language? Again, application of the principle. Unless you can clearly articulate what the common language is, you can't communicate intentionally using that language. And so what's the common language, right? And so DISC profiles might be part of that for you. Having a really clear mission, vision, values, the purpose behind the organization that's like stated for the team, right, as well as the organization, and a clear articulation of how the team level contributes to the organizational level, that facilitates part of that common language. I will often talk about the mechanics versus the dynamics. And the mechanics are the things that the team does, the activities, the tasks, the processes that they follow in order to produce the results and the achievement for the team. That the dynamics is how they go about it in order to, and that produces the engagement and the experience of the team members. And so it's the mechanics versus dynamics. And for me, I talk about the continual conversation. So a lot of teams will focus very heavily on the mechanics, what they have to do as a team. And, that's 100% important, right? Well, the team exists to produce results. And so therefore they need to focus on what they need to do to get those results. But they very rarely spend time talking about the dynamics piece. And I say, well, you need to continually be oscillated between the two. And I have that kind of represent it with an infinity symbol. And you've got to constantly be focusing on the dynamics, checking in with everybody to see how they're going and go, well, do we need to make changes? And we're talking about people's experiences, things going on outside of work changes for them. Their priorities will change. Their energy levels will change. If they're sick, all that sort of stuff. What I call their capacity, right? Their energy levels, their ability to focus, their motivation levels, all that sort of changes. And so the team, in an ideal world, should be responding to that and making whatever changes they need to in order to keep the team together, to keep it cohesive. And then we focus back on what we have to do, right? And sometimes we're changing the mechanics in order to facilitate the dynamics. What I say is if the dynamics die, the mechanics fail. And when the mechanics fail, the dynamics deteriorate, right? So they're both super important. And I think that's probably a really good place to kind of end for people is around what are you looking for? Do you need help to clearly articulate the mechanics, what you need to do in order to go to the next level and achieve the results that are set? And can you clearly articulate the dynamics as to what's going on for peoples and individuals within the thing? And that's really what we do at Lumian from a team perspective when we're doing that. And from a leader's perspective, we're equipping them to be able to monitor those and to understand how best to really influence the team system is what we're talking about there. And so, at Lumian, we spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, strategy teams and leaders kind of spaces where we play. And we spend a lot of times working with teams and leadership teams around their own dynamics. And we love to kind of go on a bit of a long-term journey with people rather than coming in and doing one workshop. And so we might come in once a quarter or twice a year or something like that. And we kind of inspire the team to do that, equip them to go and monitor those mechanics and make changes and respond and boost their performance from that. And then come back 6 months or 3 months later and say, how did you go? Okay, here's the next thing to think about. And really what we're focused on as a business is helping leaders become luminaries, right? And teams work towards going through that high performance space to becoming a luminary team. And when you think about luminaries, they're the pinnacle, right? They're really high performance performers themselves, and everybody looks to them as a role model. And luminaries in whatever field, they recognize that they stand on the shoulders of giants, and that there's been a whole lot of other people that have allowed them to get there themselves. So they're really interested in elevating other people to stand on their shoulders and achieve more than what they could. And so it's this concept of exponential influence. It's leaders developing great leaders who are able to go and develop great leaders, and working with teams to not only increase their performance, but particularly leadership teams is to develop the teams that they lead and boost their performance as well, so that the influence goes beyond borders, right? And so all these other teams across the organization are then looking to this luminary team. And even in the best case scenario, it's teams outside the organization, or other organizations are looking towards that particular team and organization as an industry leader. And so they're lining the way for those that come behind. So that's what I do. I spend a lot of time doing that. And yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. It sounds like you're going one organization at a time, making work not suck. Basically,
if we could do that, and so it's do that one organization at a time, not suck, but equip the leaders within that organization to make work not suck, so that whenever we might solve one workplace, but they then go and make that same change in whatever other workplace they get into in their career. And it's that exponential influence, right?
It's a ripple effect, isn't it? You throw a pebble into the pond and it just ripples and ripples and creates more. And it's just, it really influences not just work, but as you said before, right at the start, fatherhood, parenting, relationships, socials, what you're doing at your sports club, your community centre, it flows on to everything. So it's really
100%.
It's really exciting. And so I'll put the link into Lumian Consulting into the show notes as well. You've also got your own website with a book as well, but we haven't.
Yeah.
Do a quick plug of the book.
Well, everything that we're talking about is for me, the primary skill set that allows us to do everything that we've spoken about is coaching. As I said, once you've got coaching skills as part of your leadership toolkit, then everything that you do is enhanced by the application of those skills. And once you've got a coaching skill set part of your leadership toolkit, everything that you do can be an opportunity to develop others. And so I'm passionate about it. And really the book, The Coaching Leader, is around equipping leaders with a coaching skill set. It articulates a lot of the actual coaching skills. There's a whole lot of research around there laying the foundation. It's not just, something that's worked without there's a lot of science behind it. So I put that in there for those that are interested. It's really practical, and it's one of the pieces of consistent feedback that I get about the book is that just how practical it is. There's no point kind of saying, yes, you should coach and here's all the benefits, but not giving you enough to walk away from it. So if you're looking for a book that's going to really help you not just develop your people, but enhance your leadership in every day-to-day life, then highly recommend this one. There's a whole program that goes with it, or a one-day masterclass that you can attend as well, which is awesome. But best place to pick it up is cliffordmorgan.com.au.
We'll put the links in. I might grab a copy myself as an aspiring leader as I grow Mindful Men. We're doing some recruitment this year, so this might come in very handy for the organisational psychology of Mindful Men. But Cliff, thanks so much for coming on. Really have loved this conversation. And as I said before, I could probably unpack 15 years of public service career with you, but I won't do that to anybody right now. The last question I ask everybody to do is to plug something that's making you feel good at the moment. So often we talk about some big, heavy topics, and we've talked about a lot of workplace drama, you could say, at the moment. Just to plug something that's going to make our audience feel good as well. So it could be something you're reading, you're watching, you're listening to, a self-care activity, absolutely anything that's just lighting you up at the moment.
What's coming to mind as you ask that question, Simon, is not something that I'm doing, but something that I'm looking forward to. And that's getting back into my ice bath. I'm a big believer I just love getting into the ice bath as a practice and a discipline. There's so much science behind boosting dopamine and the physical effects, engaging autophagy in the body, and a whole bunch of stuff in there. But also from a discipline perspective and expanding mindset, and actually being able to endure hardship in order to develop character and those sorts of things. So I just have a small inflatable ice bath that I just throw some ice blocks in. But really, for me, where I am here in Australia and Queensland, the overnight temperatures just means that the kind of base level temperature of the water, it just gets too warm. And unless I'm going to go and buy 8 bags of ice, it doesn't really get the temperature down. So I'm kind of waiting till towards the back end of March when temperatures start dropping, and then I'll pull it out again. And all through winter, I'll be back in my ice bath. You just feel so good and invigorated at the end of it. For anyone that wants to learn more about it, Andrew Human, the Human Lab podcast, has a great thing around voluntary exposure to cold, and that'll tell you all the science behind it. But I'm a big fan of the ice and the cold water. So looking forward to that one. It will make me feel very good, Simon.
That's a very positive way to look at it after the initial shock of the ice cold. But yeah, Cliff, thanks again, mate. I've really enjoyed getting to know you on the show, hearing your story and all the wisdom that comes with organisational psychology.
It's been good. It's been a great chat, Simon. Look forward to doing it again at some point.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.